so I'll try not to take the whole 3 hours. There's a lot to go on this, and what I'm going to be doing briefly is looking at some of the lesser known, but I think as important, even more important, ways that psychedelics are being explored. The main way right now has to do with health, mostly mental health, and this is really Bruce's area, and he'll be talking about that, and that's where the advances are really being made. But I'm interested in the implications of psychedelics in the liberal arts and humanities, and in religion, and in an area that I'm calling mind development. So that's basically what we'll be looking at in my aspect of the talk. This is an icon I'm using for this talk. Several years ago, so I was speaking at Argosy University in Chicago, and I got there early and parked by the Chicago Art Institute and thought I'd take a look around, because one of the ideas that's coming out of this area of psychedelics is that they've been a neglected area in lots of different fields, and particularly in history and archaeology and early Western history. So I thought, well, I'll go to the museum and see if I can find some evidence of psychedelics being used, in ancient times. And I wandered around, and I got hungry. I was going to go downstairs to the little cafe, and on the way down, you pass the Greek and Roman gallery. And I took a look, and I to my amazement, was discovering this dish. Actually, it's about this big. It would be a charger now. And they have it listed as a knob-handled dish. And of course, I looked at it from the point of view of someone who's interested in psychedelics, and what immediately I saw was that these are, quote, knobs, are actually mushrooms. And this picture is from the Art Institute archive, and these are ones I've taken. There's some glass reflection. So there's a mushroom, and there's one, and there's one up there in the corner. Now, the reason this is important is that one of the big ideas that's coming out of this is that ancient Greek culture largely came out of an interest in psychedelic mushrooms. And there's a whole big field in this area, and there are only 2 artifacts that actually show some ancient Greek gods and goddesses with mushrooms. And I just happened to find this one at the Art Institute in Chicago. So what we see here is an idea that when you approach things from a psychedelic perspective, you interpret things and you notice things that aren't generally seen. And this is, I think, a pretty clear example of this. This is actually from Apulia, which is the heel of Italy right across from Greece, and was one of the very early Greek colonies there. And the people in the middle, well, I shouldn't call them people, they're gods and goddesses. And a friend of mine who's a specialty in ancient Greece says you can tell who all they are by what they're dressed and what they're handling. And what this is a picture of is Demeter and Persephone driving either into or out of Hades. And the reason this is important is that the major pre-Christian religion in Athens was the Eleusinian Mysteries. And these are built on what we would call the myth, they would call history, of Persephone and Demeter. Demeter's name is also Ceres. She's the one who's on top of the Board of Trade in Chicago. And she's the goddess of agriculture. And Persephone is her daughter. And the story is that Persephone got abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld, and Demeter was so depressed by this that she stopped all the crops growing and people started to starve and so forth. So because the people were starving, they couldn't give offerings to the gods, and the gods didn't like not having offerings, so they forced Hades to let Persephone out twice a year, and when she comes out, that's spring, and when she goes back in, that's fall, and that accounts for that. Now, the Eleusinian mystery was a mystery, and if you were initiated into it, and anybody in Athens could be initiated, even slaves, provided they had not murdered someone. And Plato and Sophocles and many of the ancient people we know from ancient Greek times were actually initiates in the Eleusinian mysteries. So in these mysteries, they served what we would call a sacrament, a dry one and a liquid one. And the current thinking is that these are made out of psychoactive fungus that grows on rye. So this early Greek civilization, which largely sort of grew into much of the Western civilization, probably came out of an interest in psychedelic mushrooms. Now, this is an example of how when you look at things from a psychedelic perspective, you notice things and you ask questions and you interpret things differently. And we'll be talking about a lot of that in about the next 45 minutes. There's a lot to go on here. And what I'm particularly interested in is this particular aspect of psychedelics. So let's take a quick walk through some of this and get some of the perspective. This is an idea I've developed. You're the first group to have this presented to. It went online in Alternet last Friday and in my website last Friday. And the idea that I'm developing is that what we think of as psychedelics really are going through a four-stage development. And the one that's getting most of the attention, the one that Bruce specializes in, is the health and neuroscientific area. And psychedelics are being used in a lot of experimental clinical research now with very good results, by the way. The second is the spiritual religious area, and in this they're often called entheogens, theo meaning the word God, so entheogen is an experience that develops the sense of God or sacredness. And what I'm particularly interested in is the intellectual artistic area and an area called mind design. And so I've called this the continent of ideas, because once you start looking at practically every discipline there is from a psychedelic perspective, there are new questions to ask, new experiments to run, new interpretations to develop. So this field is just growing. A simile that I like to use is this idea of a psychedelic renaissance. And from the perspective of a psychedelic renaissance, the health and neuroscientific area is growing and leafing out, but still sort of small. The religious spiritual area is sprouting. The intellectual artistic area, the seeds are germinating, but they haven't sprouted yet. And the mind design area, we're not sure what the seeds are and what they will be. We'll talk a little bit about that, I hope, at the end of the talk. So let's move on and talk about some of the ideas that I consider this continent of ideas. And it's a continent to get across the idea of the vast number of ideas and questions and things that can be looked at. This is a sort of a graphic representation, that circle pie chart, of what I call the multi-state continent. And it's recognizing that as humans, we can produce and use a large number of mind-body states. They're also called states of consciousness. I don't use the word consciousness because it has lots of different meanings, and people who are using the word think they're communicating to other people who are using the word, but they're actually meaning different things. So what I'm recognizing is that if we have an image of this as a pie chart, one of these areas, this one here, are psychedelic drugs, but there are a lot of other psychoactive drugs, and caffeine and alcohol and tobacco are the common ones. But actually the view of the human mind has to include not only the states that we produce with psychoactive drugs, but those that come about through our ordinary awake state, dreaming, meditation, psychoactive drugs, and so forth. So there's a much huger view of the human mind, because the human mind is almost always studied in our ordinary awake state of consciousness, our ordinary mind-body state. But there are all these other states, and it's just being sort of odd things at the edge of human existence and human culture. I think they really deserve a place at the very center of the studies of the human mind and of human psychology especially. And so this is a sort of schematic map of a much larger view of the human mind. And once we have a larger view of our minds, we recognize our minds can do more, can think more, and can develop a lot more than just our development in our ordinary awake default mind-body state, the one most of us are probably in now or very close to it. And I like to think of these techniques as being collections of ways of entering biological programs in our minds. And just as in your computers, your electronic devices, you can install a number of apps, and the more apps you install, the more things you can do with your mind. The number of mind apps you install in your minds, the more things you can do with our minds. So our minds can have mind apps installed in them, just as electronic devices can have electronic apps put in them. And as we do that, we will be able to do more things with our minds, just as we can do more things with our devices when we install more apps. This is what I mean by a very big idea, an idea of what our minds are and of what they can be. So we'll be looking at some of those possibilities today, and I hope that my talk will just sort of stimulate you to follow up on some of them. So here's one of the useful analogies. Digital apps are to devices as mind apps are to minds. And psychedelics are one family of mind apps, but there are a lot of members of that family, and they're a member of a much bigger tribe, the whole psychoactive drug tribe. So looking at psychedelics, we're looking at a narrow slice of the pie. Okay, now here's some of the ideas that I find the psychedelics are particularly good at thinking about. To me, emergence is the single most interesting, difficult idea in the sciences. And what it is, it's the idea that when you put things together in a complicated way, characteristics will evolve that aren't any part of the parts. And the classic example here, of course, is always water. You take oxygen gas, you take hydrogen gas, they have certain qualities. You put them together and you get water, and all the watery characteristics, quote, emerge. That is, where do they come from? How is it that oxygen and water, two gases put together, emerge into water, and then you get the watery characteristics that we all think about? So what I'm doing again is applying this to our minds. So instead of just mixing hydrogen and oxygen, we mix our brain and these psychotechnologies, and they would then result in a new, I'll call it a state of consciousness now, a new state of consciousness. Now, consciousness is one of the very difficult things to study because we really have one or maybe three examples. We have an ordinary awake state, we have sleeping, and we have dreaming, okay? And the reason that we want to look at this is one of the very difficult philosophical questions, and here's where philosophy sneaks into this, is how does consciousness arise? Is it an emergent property of our brains? In other words, if you put together the neurological system complicated enough, does it produce awareness, consciousness, just the same way that oxygen and hydrogen produce water? And when we see that that happens, this gives us more experimental ways of looking at consciousness. We can do experiments in which consciousness is what results, and different types of experiments will give us more examples, and the more examples you have of something, the better you can generalize and find the general principles that are lurking behind this idea of emergence. So again, if we take our brain and we take any number of these mind apps that exist in the continent of ideas, then we get a number of other mind-body states or states of consciousness, and we can try to figure out how is it that our brains produce consciousness. This is known as the hard question, okay? And we now can do experimental studies in the hard question rather than just philosophize about it. Consilience is definitely one of my favorite ideas. It's a really simple idea, except it's very complicated when you start to use it. It's the idea that, you start with subatomic particles, and then you build atomic particles, and then those get into the elements, and you put those together, and you get molecules, and you get biology, and then you get psychology, and so forth. So the idea of consilience is to try to build a model that links all these different fields together. Okay, and E.O. Wilson, the highly esteemed biologist, he's Mr. Ant. He's the guy. If you want to study ants, you study Wilson, and he's gone into a lot of biology beyond that. So the idea is that we start with, physics and sort of work up, and he suggests we build sort of a scaffolding of ideas, so that the physics is linked to chemistry and is linked to biology and so forth. Now, where psychedelics come into this is that, again, one of the ways you want to do is to approach this through experiments, and psychedelic experiments often turn out to be, although they're not planned that way, examples of consilience. For example, you take a psychedelic drug, let's say at level 2, and it will affect the things people think about in religion or humanities or the arts. So we've got an experiment going in which we can actually do a consilience study by putting something in at one level, in this case psychedelics work very nicely at this, and see how they ramify themselves in other levels. Or we can take examples of how people's thinking affects their reaction to drugs, because drugs are not just basically a biological effect, they're also the person's expectations. And in this morning's Science Digest, there's a fascinating little article on nicotine smokers, and they gave nicotine smokers cigarettes that had nicotine in it and cigarettes that didn't have nicotine in it, and they found that the people who didn't have nicotine in it had as much response as those who did have nicotine, which means it's their expectation that causes the response. Now this opens the door of doing experiments from the top down. So we find out what somebody's thoughts are over here on the right. How do thoughts, expectations, group standards and so forth affect the experiences below? And one of the things that always comes out in psychedelics is that the set and setting are two of the big influences on the effect of psychedelics. Set is the person's sort of psychological makeup, and setting is location. So when we're studying psychedelics, we're not just studying giving somebody a chemical drug and seeing what happens biologically. That's a large part of what's happening. But we're also looking at how the person's expectations for the drug will influence the person's experience of the drug and even the influence of the drug. So this allows us to do a bunch of studies, not just with psychedelics, but with all those mind-body apps, those mind apps, to look at how different levels affect each other and to fill in the scaffolding with links and ideas. Some of the ideas that are really intriguing in the humanities have come out of experiments done largely at Johns Hopkins Medical School, but also elsewhere, in which they've given a highly selective bunch of volunteers. And I want to stress this is a highly selective bunch. It's not generalizable to the whole population. Mystical experiences with psychedelics. The one they used is a psilocybin, the active part of one type of psychedelic mushroom. And they do this as a part of a full day experiment in which the person is in a room with 2 monitors all day long. They've gone through 10 to 12 hours of previous preparation. They've had their session, they're with the monitors, and afterwards there's an integration session that happens. So these results are not, well, let's put it this way, if you go down to CVS and you bought some LSD, you would not necessarily have these experiences, okay? It's the whole treatment that results in these experiences. And what I find interesting about these is that these topics are ones which people report major changes in the way they experience themselves. And meaningfulness, and that's basically a psychological philosophical idea when you talk about something being meaningful. And yet, the people in these studies have reported higher scores on meaningfulness than they had previously. Spiritual significance is a fascinating one. About a third of the people who had mystical experiences, and that's about 50 to 60% of the volunteers, okay, said that experience, and let me say the average age of these was about 44 years old. So these are people who have a considerable life experience. About 33 said that experience was the most spiritually significant experience in their life. And another, about a third, giving a total of 67%, said one of the 5 most significant spiritual experiences in their life. So here we get into experimental religion and theology, okay? Instead of just looking at sacred texts and thinking so-and-so religious leader says this, somebody says something else, it's now possible to do experiments in the philosophy of religion and religious studies. So this opens up an enormous field that has been closed to experimental studies before. Altruism is an interesting one. You know, altruism is willing to do beneficial things for other people. And they found out that did a comparison with this group using Ritalin. By the way, they have a control group that they use Ritalin for, so that there would be something to compare it to. And the Ritalin group scored 19% higher on the scale, while the psilocybin group scored 44%. And this is an interesting one, open-mindedness. In psychology, there's a current theory of 5 big characteristics of human psychology, and one of them is open-mindedness. And this is the willingness to be open to new ideas, to usually have an aesthetic sense. And we know what we mean when we speak about somebody being open-minded. And they found out that there was a 60% increase in an open-mindedness score using one of the standard psychological tests. Now, this is especially curious because usually people's major psychological traits are set by about the time they're 30. Look out, those of you who are approaching 30, you're going to be set in concrete. Now, not for everyone, but usually. Now, this again was a group of people who were well into middle age who changed their openness scales. The other 4 scales did not change significantly. So this is a way of actually making people more open-minded. And open-mindedness is the central value of learning probably in almost every field. It makes, what it is, it makes people willing to accept and consider new ideas. So then we can do experiments that asked how do, and you insert any one of those into the question, vary from a default mind-body state to LSD states or psilocybin states or any other states. So this then opens a whole area of experimental studies in the humanities, in philosophy, in religion, and so forth, which have not been opened before, or open in a very limited sense. In psychology, there's experiments. My overcharacterization of them is they're usually done in labs that are entirely unlike the real world, in which people are separated from important things, and they learn to observe insignificant differences that are measured often enough to make them significant. Now, this meaningfulness, spiritualness, these are not insignificant traits. Now, here's one of the big questions that comes from this. Whatever you're studying, whatever you're interested in, you can insert this in the question. You see how this blows the roof off of all these fields. How does or do, just take whatever you're interested in, vary from mind-body state to mind-body state. So all those questions and all the social sciences and all the humanities get re-asked from this. And we have to recognize this is not just one question, but the variable that can be used is any number of different ones of these apps. Not only psychoactive apps, not only psychedelic apps, but all the apps from all the, dreaming, meditation, hypnosis, prayer, breathing techniques, martial arts. These are all mind apps. So every one of these questions that exist now gets raised several powers for every one of these apps that are out there. This is what I mean by a continent of ideas. There's an enormous amount going on here. Okay, here's our icon again with this idea of the families of psychotechnologies. And let's take a look at taking this idea in a different direction. What we're looking at now is a number of slides or ideas that have to do with ideas that psychedelic studies have contributed to understanding the humanities. This is Stanislav Grof, the world's primary researcher on the clinical uses of LSD. And one of the things he has invented is a view of the human mind that includes 4 different levels. One of the levels, strangely enough, is that at a very deep level of our minds, we may have actual memories of our own birth experiences. There's a pretty good body of evidence showing how prenatal and perinatal experiences affect people's personalities. They've done a lot of this, particularly in Australia. What he's done in this book is to take that middle level of birth memories and use them to interpret the works of Geiger. Geiger is one of the major artists currently living in Switzerland, and I don't know how to characterize his drawings other than they're also often very frightening. They're machines crushing babies, and part of the BPM perinatal level is the insight of contractions, and Geiger is particularly good at this. But what Grof is giving in a bigger framework is a new type of psychocriticism. Psychocriticism is using ideas from psychology to interpret works of art, and the best known, of course, are Freudian and Jungian. I mean, we have like Freudian analysis all over the place, so much that it's become often a joke. But this is another bunch of ideas developed from Grof's clinical psychiatric work, largely with patients people who are patients rather than a normal population. And here are a bunch of other leads that come out of Grof's work. On the sort of 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock area is I've done an analysis of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Movies are lots of fun to work with, okay? Huxley's novel, The Island, is about an imaginary island where people take a drug called moksha, and this was Huxley's last one. Some of you might recognize up in the upper right-hand corner, that's from Pink Floyd, The Wall. And one of the ideas sort of lurking around in the back of my mind is I've got to write an analysis of Pink Floyd's The Wall, because it fits in very beautifully with all 4 levels that Grof has discovered in our minds, as well as the particulars of individual levels. So here's a whole new way of analyzing art, poems, music, and so forth. Grof has written a fascinating article in which he points out that if you look at the vocabulary of the great military leaders of all times, and you start with Alexander the Great and ends with Hitler, and you look at the vocabulary and you ask how do they get their people to go to war, one of the ways they do it is to use this birth imagery. Let me give you an example. For example, Hitler used the idea that Germany was being crushed by its hostile borders. Land was taken away from it, which it was, and this is the BPM2, the contractions area. Now the way to get out of BPM2, BPM is basic perinatal matrix. The way to get out of that is BPM3, which is the movement through the birth canal, which is war imagery. And what leaders typically do is to express to their followers that they are in BPM2, and the way to get out of it is BPM3, war. And Hitler used the word Lebensraum. It means room to live in. That is, we're crushed. We need to expand. We need room to live in, which historically hit the German population at a very susceptible time. Riedlinger, who used to live in Brookfield, has written a wonderful article interpreting Jean-Paul Sartre's mescaline experience, and finds that that experience, which was unresolved, had a lot of effect on Sartre's ideas. Joseph Campbell, sort of Mr. Myth and Symbol guy, read a manuscript of Grof's main book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and said that his work in studying mythology parallels Grof's, so working from very different angles, myth and symbol through Campbell, and psychotherapy through Grof, they found the same sort of structures emerging in human mind for Grof and culture for Campbell. So the mind then is manifesting itself in culture. The Apples of Apollo is a wonderful book that gets back to that question I started with. Did ancient Greek culture start with an interest in psychoactive mushrooms? And finally, Hillman was a student at the University of Wisconsin who was studying botany, and he switched over to studying classics. And to combine the two, he wanted to write a doctoral dissertation pointing out that in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the people used psychoactive drugs to a very large extent. His doctoral dissertation advisor was so upset about this that he would not approve the dissertation unless he removed those references. So under pressure, Hillman removed the references and then wrote this book of all the information that has accumulated. So this is a very good book on the history of psychoactive plants in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And there again, we see people are asking new questions and coming up with new answers to it. Finally, I want to talk a bit about enhancing cognition and looking at it three different ways. Usually, when we think about enhancing cognition, it may be taking something so you can study all night or study longer or remember something better. That's the usual approach to the using drugs in cognitive enhancement, what people usually think of. But I want to talk about two additional ones that come out of psychedelic research. One of them is in creative problem solving. At least one Nobel Prize, the development of the Pcr technique, was developed largely by Kary Mullis, who developed a visual skill while tripping and then carried it back to his ordinary state and came up with the idea of the Pcr technique. In medicine and biology, a problem was that samples are often so small you couldn't run a test on them because you'd destroy them. And what the Pcr technique does, those of you who are in forensics, you know this stuff, or biological research, you can take a small biological sample and use its DNA to grow more so you can test it. So he's the guy who broke that barrier in medicine and forensics and in botany and biology. Shelf space is an interesting one. When the computer history was first going, there were a lot of people who were developing languages and trying to get other people to buy them. And in business, this is called the shelf space problem. If you come up with let's say a new toothpaste, how are you going to get CVS to stock it? Okay, they've got dozens of brands as it is, so you can't get yours on the shelf. That's shelf space. And the same thing was going on in computer history. People were coming up with these different languages, but how do you get people to buy them? So people were, sending out messages. This is actually before the internet. They didn't send out internet messages. They'd post notices and write to people and try to sell it, and people wouldn't, few people would buy this, few people would buy that, but there were dozens of these around. One guy named Bob Wallace came up with an idea. He said, let's give it away. Okay, and we'll give it away. We'll ask people to donate whatever they can back to the company. Okay, which seems like a nutty idea, but he attributes it to his own psychedelic experiences. So the company, this little startup company nobody had ever heard of, in fact, it was so small and so insignificant, they paid their people enough to buy food, rent, and car gas, and a little bit of clothing, and they had to pay the rest of them in worthless stock. So this company started giving away their program. Because it was free, lots of people used it. And because so many people used it, the money started to come in and pay for itself. And because so many people used it, this is the program that people started to write programs for. And the name of the company that those poor original people got donated stock instead of payment is Microsoft. That's how Microsoft captured the market. Okay, so Bob Wallace attributes this to his psychedelic experiences. There are other studies that have been done on professional problem solving with engineers, scientists, designers, architects, and so forth. I very strongly recommend Jim Fadiman's book on this. It really covers it, and not only does it report the results, but he was one of the original investigators. He's now 75 years old, so was a young man at the time. It came out in 1966, and he has quotations from the people who are actually doing the research. So psychedelics might be used to help cognitive enhancement by problem solving, and psychotherapy, that's the big one that's going on now, and the areas are particularly PTSD, death anxiety, alcoholics, addictions, psychoses, and neuroses. This is the big hot area that's likely to catch on first. So let's look at another question. A paradigm is the sort of whole ball of wax that you'll use for approaching a field. For example, when you take a chemistry course, on the front of the room is the periodic table, right? And that is the sort of paradigm of current chemistry. If you do a chemical experiment to identify an unknown substance, and you tell the professor it's earth, air, fire, and water, that doesn't count. So a paradigm tells you what a legitimate question is and what a legitimate answer is. Now, the big advances often happen when people come up with different paradigms. For example, the movement from a Earth-centered view of the cosmos to a sun-centered view was a big advance. I know we've gone beyond that, but that was a paradigm shift. So people stopped asking questions about stars circulating on crystal globes running around the Earth and started asking different types of questions. Now, there's an interesting study that came out of a psychedelic study. A cognitive psychologist at Hebrew University in Israel went on vacation to Brazil and tried the psychoactive tea ayahuasca. And of course had unusual experiences, and being a cognitive psychologist immediately thought, why am I thinking differently? What's going on here? Okay. And he then had a large number of experiences himself, interviewed Brazilians, North Americans, and Europeans who had the experience, and collected all the information together into this book called Antipodes of the Mind. And what he did is realized that cognitive psychology could help you understand psychedelic experiences, and psychedelic experiences would give you new experiences to think about using cognitive psychology. So these two fields were then feeding off each other. And as I pointed out, the same thing has happened in archaeology of ancient Greece and in a number of different fields. So what's happened is that looking at this through ayahuasca-informed eyes, he came up with a lot of questions that normally were not asked and weren't answered and weren't even considered as variables. For example, we generally think it's impossible for somebody to pick up ideas from somebody else's mind and have somebody else's experience. Yet this is a common experience with psychedelics. So what he did, in a sense, is to invent a new paradigm of cognitive psychology that took into account that little sort of pie shape of our big icon picture. And what I'm thinking is, I think he's hit on something of a consistent way, systematic way of developing new paradigms. That is through other mind-body experiences, both psychedelic and non-psychedelic. And this then is an example of what happens with use that big pie-shaped chart. You ask different questions and you notice different things. And there are experimental ways of investigating it through different mind-body states. Okay, here's an example of what I talk about. Let me say the third idea here is mind design. This is something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And this is a very powerful magnet. If it's placed against people's brains, it will actually affect the brain. I mean, after all, our brains, among other things, are electromagnetic events going on. And this is being used particularly in areas of depression right now. Research is coming along on this. So the question I'm looking at is, most of these psychotechnologies that we've talked about are used one at a time. Okay, I mean, let's say hypnosis, or meditation, or breathing techniques, or any of the various psychoactive drugs. Usually you do one at a time. Now, what would happen if, instead of using one at a time, we use two? Okay. What experiences would we have? What would we discover about our brains? In other words, the idea of mind apps are not just single things that we would sort of install in our minds, but we can invent new mind apps just as people invent new electronic apps. So here's an idea for inventing mind apps. So we take electromagnetic transcranial stimulation. A psychoactive drug gives us what? Or there's an unlimited possibility of a number of recipes. So, take something from here and something from here and something from there. And remember, each of these are collections. They're not just one thing. And what will this result in? So what happens then is our minds become variables. Okay? We can invent different minds and install different minds. don't go and do this tonight, okay? There are probably a lot of cautions to take care of this. But this is an idea of what our minds might be when we start using these various mind apps in various combinations. So what do we call people who do this? This, I think, is one of the biggest unknown, unexplored fields around. So let's get back to this image of consilience, where we're looking at the different levels of studying from actually these subatomic particles up through the humanities. In physics, there are the synthetic elements. There's elements that don't exist naturally in nature. They've been developed, invented in the lab. So we have synthetic physics. Synthetic chemistry, this room is largely a result of synthetic chemistry. Most of the stuff around us now is not naturally occurring. Plastics are a perfect example of this, okay? So synthetic chemistry has just enormously enriched our lives. Synthetic biology, if I were going to undergraduate school, I would certainly want to look at synthetic biology. It's not just a matter of GMO plants and doing hybrid stuff, but taking the processes that produce plants and plant molecules and using those as productive processes. I mean, think of a huge machine shop with lots of different machines. Those machines are now biological processes, or biological processes are now those machines. And people can put them together to create and invent new processes and new substances that didn't exist before. So synthetic biology is an incredibly rich field. How about synthetic mind-body states? Those are the ones I was just talking about. We have our ordinary state and, you know, its little variations here and there, but it's possible also to invent a large number of new mind-body states, just as there were new synthetic materials. And finally, what are the implications for the social sciences and humanities? I wish I had a nice answer for this. Interpretation of what's there is part of it, but what would it mean to have a social science based on different mind-body states? Or to be in different mind-body states and interpret your favorite social science that way. I mean, suppose you're a psychologist or a sociologist or a historian, you know, and you start asking different questions. That's part of that big continent of ideas. So psychedelics are not just treatments. They're not just fun things to do on Saturday afternoon. They actually can be research methods, see? And we can use them to produce not just things that are interesting to study. I mean, in biology you might study, you know, what is a psychedelic, what does it do to the nervous system, blah, 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 okay? Those are all good questions. That's standard science, standard way of thinking of things. As research methods, they then become the variables that you change. They and the other things in that nice big pie chart. Okay, thanks for letting me talk about this. This is my favorite thing to talk about. If you're interested in seeing the slides, they're at my website. You'll see lectures, and it doesn't start with that slide from the Art Institute. This is the first time I've used that slide, so you're the premier on that. But you'll find it. It's a talk I gave last November at the Groff Foundation in San Francisco.